In a prior video, we talked about the best champion of every current title in WWE. But what about the flip side to that? What about the worst holders of each individual belt? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the worst WWE champion of all time, Jinder Mahal. Yes, who thought it would be a good idea to give the top prize in your company to a guy who spent the entirety of his career before that being a jobber to the stars? Sure, none of this is the fault of Jinder himself. No, he's a good wrestler who was just taking an opportunity that anyone in his position would have taken. But that doesn't change the fact that he just wasn't ready for the spot at this time. As you can probably imagine then, fans everywhere widely rejected this one. And so it was that after losing the title to AJ Styles in November of 2017, a full 170 days after he won it, audiences would rejoice. That's right, even more so than the incredibly short runs people like Kane, Rey Mysterio, and Andre the Giant had with the strap, this one, the reign of Jinder Mahal, while significantly longer, still beats them by a country mile when we're talking about the worst in terms of the WWE title. But what about the other world title in current-day WWE, the World Heavyweight title? Well, while that has a short history, there have been a few champions already, and the weakest of these, for our money, can be none other than Drew McIntyre. Of course, this is not to say Drew McIntyre couldn't have had a great run with the World Heavyweight title if he'd been given the chance. No, he's one of the best things about current-day wrestling. And that's been evidenced in everything he's done over the last couple of years. Unfortunately for him, though, when he was finally able to win the top prize on Raw at WrestleMania 40 Night 2, he'd find that his time in the spotlight was only destined to last for a matter of minutes. Why was this? Well, because mere moments after getting the better of Seth Rollins, Drew would be a victim of a Money in the Bank cash-in, one from Damian Priest. And with the Scotsman already being pretty beat down by this point, combined with the fact CM Punk had also just laid him out post-match, it meant he'd be easy pickings for the then Judgment Day member. Yes, Drew McIntyre is one of those unfortunate cases of a champ whose run lasted for less than a day. Hell, it lasted less than an hour, and that easily makes this reign the worst of the four that belt currently has. And he's not the only one who had his time on top with a belt cut dramatically short, as the same thing would happen with the worst Intercontinental champion of all time, Dean Douglas. Now, many fans will be more familiar with Dean Douglas under his other name of Shane Douglas, the franchise of ECW. But back during that brief period he was working for WWF during the New Generation era, he didn't have that same air of extreme to him. No, back then he had the role of Evil Teacher, a cartoon gimmick if we ever saw one. And it was while in this guise that he was supposed to win the Intercontinental title from Shawn Michaels at In Your House 4 in October of 1995. After HBK ended up getting beaten up by a bunch of sailors, however, he'd be deemed unable to compete, and that led to Douglas simply being awarded the belt instead. That said, if he thought this was going to be the start of a lengthy run on top for him, then he was very wrong, because immediately following this, he'd be challenged by Razor Ramon, with Ramon going on to beat him in just 11 minutes. That's right, in New Generation era WWF, the Clique always came out on top, so because of this, Dean Douglas would go down as the worst Intercontinental champion in history, not an honor anyone wants to have. But what of the recently introduced women's equivalent to this particular piece of hardware, the aptly named Women's Intercontinental title? Well, when it comes to the worst holder of that one, there can only be one answer, and that answer is Lyra Valkyria. Not because Lyra has been having a bad reign necessarily. No, for what she's been given so far, she's been good. But given she is the only Women's Intercontinental champion to date, then she has to be both the best and worst by default. Yes, it's almost a guarantee that a worse champion will come along at some point. These things always happen, but that hasn't happened as of the time of this video's recording. Now, as it stands right now, the Irish woman is the inaugural and current holder of the mid-card prize, meaning hers is the only reign we can judge, whether positively or negatively. And that means, for the purposes of this video, she has to rank right at the bottom of the pile, despite the fact she has overall been solid in her role over on Raw. Really, this is one we might have to revisit when there's a stronger lineage of champions for that strap, as it feels unfair to put Lyra in such a spot. But then there's no other spot we can put her in, and the same could be said of the woman who currently holds the Women's United States title, Chelsea Green. Why is that? Well, because like with Lyra Valkyria, Chelsea Green is, to date, the only Women's United States champion. Yes, after winning it in the finals of a tournament held at Saturday night's main event in December of 2024, she's continued to keep it around her waist, all with a little help from her backup, Piper Niven and Alba Fire. How has she done during this run? Well, it's a lot of character work above all else, and she's succeeded as she's gotten over with the audience over on SmackDown. Still though, like with Lyra Valkyria, given that she's the only champion to date, she has to rank as both the best and the worst of the bunch. And since this video is about the worst, that means she's earned a place here too. Sure, this will also likely change with time as other women get their own runs with the United States Championship, but that's not how things stand today. Luckily though, not every woman's title in WWE has such a short lineage. No, when it comes to the world titles, they've been around for a lot longer. And when it comes to one of these belts, the WWE Women's title, which is currently being defended on SmackDown, the worst reign for our money has to be that of Nikki ASH. Really, this is an unfortunate one, as by the time Nikki ASH became WWE Women's Champion back in the summer of 2021, she had everything working against her. After all, rather than playing the mad psychopath she'd been brought into the company as, the woman named Nikki Cross, she'd be repackaged as the more child-friendly Nikki ASH, a woman who was almost a superhero. As you can imagine then, having the gimmick of not quite being good enough to be a superhero didn't exactly get the Glasgow native over. And that meant when she won the Women's Money in the Bank ladder match that year, then later cashed in her contract on Charlotte Flair, it didn't feel like the big crowning moment it could have. Still, it could have worked out in the long run had her actual time as champ been anything to write home about, and so it was then that for the next 33 days, Nikki would do little more than keep the belt warm so that Charlotte could eventually come and win it back off of her. Not exactly the kind of thing she likely dreamed about when she dreamed about finally being champion. But what of the other women's world title of current-day WWE, the Women's World Championship? That must have had a few bad reigns in the past, right? Well, yes it does, and the worst of them all has to be Ronda Rousey's. Now, when Ronda Rousey first joined WWE in 2018, there was a huge buzz in the air, and that was because she was a true superstar of combat sports who, as it turned out, had taken to the squared circle like a duck to water. So when she was feuding with Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair heading into the main event of WrestleMania 35, it felt like an event. Unfortunately though, after she took a sabbatical following her defeat there and didn't return until a few years later, it became apparent any passion she had for the ring was gone. Why was this? Well, if her autobiography is to be believed, she'd become completely disenfranchised with the entire industry, and this showed in her ring work throughout 2022. Still though, this didn't stop WWE from making her Women's World Champion on two separate occasions here, with her first reign starting when she beat Charlotte Flair at WrestleMania Backlash in May of that year. Of course, getting the belt here did little to motivate Ronda. Hell, even when she briefly lost the title to Liv Morgan and then won it back again a few months later, it was clear she was already thinking about her exit strategy. And all this led to a reign that was so uneventful, fans were excited to see her drop the title when Charlotte Flair won the belt back again by the time December rolled around. But let's move away from the women for a moment and back over to the men again, as there's still one big main roster men's title belt we haven't looked at yet, the United States title, with the worst holder of that belt being Bret Hitman Hart. Yes, there is a caveat here. After all, by the time the Excellence of Execution won this back in May of 2010, he hadn't been an active wrestler in years. And yes, we know he was US champ back during his time in WCW as well, but for the purposes of this video, we are only talking about the WWE version of the strap. So why was Bret able to win the gold despite being retired? Well, after making his sort of comeback to wrestling at that year's WrestleMania to have an absolute stinker with Vince McMahon, the Hitman got a chance to challenge The Miz for the secondary gold. And because this bout didn't require him to take any bumps, just put his opponent in a sharpshooter and tap him out quickly, it meant WWE were okay with him doing it. Of course, now that he was United States champion again though, there was no way Bret was going to be able to defend it in a competitive match. And that's why, just 7 days later, the Canadian would vacate the title in the middle of the ring. That's right, this really has to rank as the worst US title reign for that reason alone, even if it was designed to do a nice thing for Hart. But what about WWE's developmental brand, NXT? Who was their worst ever champion? Well, for this one, we've gone with Dolph Ziggler. And this one really was a tough choice, as there really haven't been any truly bad NXT champs at all. No, every single champion has had their own positives to offer. However, in the case of Dolph, he was only on the brand for a short period of time, and with him holding on to the title for less than a month, he had one of the shortest reigns ever. Having said that though, he did manage to successfully put Braun Breaker over on his way out, so this reign really wasn't all that bad in its own right. Maybe if he had a chance to hold the belt a little longer, then it would be remembered more fondly, but unfortunately for him, it just wasn't the case. So for that reason, we have to call this one the worst of all the NXT title runs then. But what of the NXT Women's title? Well, when it comes to the worst run with that belt, the unfortunate honor has to go to Indi Hartwell. Why Indi Hartwell? Well, because she didn't get to do anything with it after she won it in April of 2023 during a 6-women ladder match, which also featured Gigi Dolan, Lyra Valkyria, Tiffany Stratton, Zoe Stark, and Roxanne Perez. Now, immediately after climbing the top of the mountain, she would be called up to Raw. And to make matters even worse for her, this was the point where the Australian had injured her foot, so after vacating the NXT Women's title, she wasn't able to wrestle on Monday nights for a while either. Yes, this was just a case of bad timing, and this hampered Hartwell's momentum overall. But what about the secondary women's title of NXT, the Women's North American title? Well, the worst run with that one wasn't so bad. It was still enough to earn Fallon Henley a spot in this video. To be fair to Fallon, though, it wasn't like she had a terrible run here. No, her 110 days as champion between October of 2024 and February of 2025 were very good. But considering there are only 3 holders of this belt in its short history, someone has to rank at the bottom. And for all the Tampa native was able to do, she wasn't able to match up to either the inaugural reign from Kalani Jordan or the current reign from Stephanie Vaquer. No, while she would have a notable feud with Gigi Dolan during her time as champion, there just wasn't as much to write home about when it came to Fallon Henley's Women's North American title reign. And so for that reason then, she pretty much comes in at the bottom of the pile by default. It could have been worse. She could have had an outright bad reign. After all, it wouldn't be unheard of for such a thing to happen once a belt has been sound for long enough. In fact, this was what would happen with our next belt, the Men's North American title, when it was held by our next subject back in the winter of 2020. Who are we talking about here? Why, Leon Ruff, of course. Of course, when it comes to Leon Ruff's time spent as North American champion, we can't entirely blame him for it being a failure. No, like with others we've discussed already, such as Indi Hartwell, things just never worked out his way in the long run. After all, the idea behind this one was, what if a rookie scored an upset win over Johnny Gargano and then found himself out of his depth in the subsequent weeks? It's not exactly the makings of a strong champion, and it didn't do much to raise Ruff's stock back when he beat Johnny Wrestling for the gold back in November of 2020. Now, all this reign would do would cement the idea that the rookie just wasn't up to par with the other members of the roster. So it really should come as no surprise this one ranks right at the bottom when we talk about North American title reigns. And there's also the fact it was such a short reign before Leon dropped it back to Gargano, and the whole thing was pretty much erased from many fans' memories. And we mean it when we say it was erased from memory, because afterwards, Leon Ruff would do nothing of note before he was released from his contract in August of 2021. Still, it could have been worse because at least the North American title has a lot of prestige, the same of which can't yet be said for our next title and the worst person to have a run with it. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Ricochet and his spell as WWE Men's Speed Champion. That's right, when Ricochet first joined the WWE in 2018, he was coming off of a great run on the Indies. Come 2024, though, he'd pretty much fallen to the role of mid-carder, who most fans just didn't believe in anymore. And this meant that when WWE began introducing their new Speed Championship in April of that year then, a title which would be defended exclusively on Twitter and which wouldn't be referenced on regular TV, Ricochet felt like the perfect person for the job as he wasn't doing anything else at the time and was also able to put on a great short match. Sadly, though, all this run did was further hurt him in the long run because, despite getting the honor of becoming the inaugural champ, it soon became apparent that without TV time as champion, fans still just weren't taking to him, with him eventually leaving altogether and moving over to AEW. One person who has been able to recover from a bad title run in WWE, though, would be our next subject, the Women's Speed Champion, Candice LeRae. Of course, to be fair to Candice, though, this is another case of there only being one champion to choose from, because as it stands today, she remains the inaugural holder of this piece of hardware. Unfortunately, though, like with the men's title, this belt has been given such little attention, many fans have forgotten it exists at times. Yes, as a prize that's never seen on regular TV, only on Twitter, it's one which doesn't exactly have a lot of prestige as of yet. And that makes it hard for anyone to have a good run with it, even someone as talented as Candice LeRae is. Is there anything she can do to turn his fortunes around? Maybe. We certainly hope so, but then again, maybe LeRae can hope that when someone eventually dethrones her, she's able to move on to bigger and better titles instead. But what of a belt that's not really a belt? What of a belt that's a trophy instead? Well, that's the situation with the NXT Heritage Cup. And when it comes to that prize, the worst holder of that has to be Mark Coffey. Yes, this is another case of a wrestler not being bad in his own right. Unfortunately for the Gallus member, though, when he got a shot with the Heritage Cup back in 2022 during the time it was still being defended exclusively on NXT UK, he just didn't get a chance to go anywhere with it. And the reason for that was because his reign only lasted for 42 days, 14 in truth, if we account for the fact that episodes back then were often aired on delay. So there really was no opportunity for Coffey to make his mark on what has come to be one of the more unique titles in WWE. No, all he could do was keep it warm for fellow Scotsman Noam Dar to win it back off of him before the summer was over. Not exactly a historic run. But let's move away from singles prizes for now and over to tag team belts, and of all these reigns, there are arguably none worse than the women's tag team title reign from Alexa Bliss and Asuka when they briefly held them in the autumn of 2022. Why are we choosing to go with Alexa Bliss and Asuka's run here over ones like Zelina Vega and Carmella, Raquel Rodriguez and Aaliyah, or Chelsea Green and Sonya Deville? Well, because even in a division largely made of thrown together at the last minute makeshift teams, pairing the Goddess with the Empress of Tomorrow felt like a particularly weird one. After all, it's not like their characters have anything in common, and it's not like they were aligned over the long term at any point. But even if this is the case, it still didn't stop them from winning the gold from Damage Control in October of that year. What would they do now that they had the belts? Would they establish themselves as a real team and rack up a series of defenses? Not quite. In fact, in the end, their reign would be over just 4 days later, and that's because this was the point Damage Control won the title back again during the rematch. Really, there's an argument to be made that of all the bad title runs in WWE history, this has to rank way up there amongst the worst. But is it as bad as our next title reign, the one which came when Kenzo Suzuki and Rene Dupree became World Tag Team Champions back in the autumn of 2004? That's right, much like with the women's tag team division, back during the Ruthless Aggression era, the men's tag team division in WWE was at a low point, with it almost never getting any real focus. Hell, it was largely made up of makeshift teams that had never partnered up before prior to that. And that's how we got a situation when, in September of 2004, Kenzo Suzuki and Rene Dupree, two performers who couldn't seem more different if they tried, briefly won the gold. And you can imagine then their lack of chemistry together, combined with the fact that they were given no notable feuds to work with, made this whole run a bit of a wash. And for that reason, it has since gone largely forgotten by many fans today. But for those who do recall it, they'll remember just how weak it was and how much it only further cemented the idea that tag team wrestling was pretty bad at that time, even if Suzuki and Dupree were by themselves very good performers. Still, though, even this run arguably wasn't as bad as the worst one for the other main roster tag titles of current-day WWE, the WWE Tag Team titles. And the reason for that is because the worst run with those belts was given to us by Shane McMahon and The Miz. Yes, since these particular belts were introduced in 2016, there have been some notable teams who have held the WWE Tag Team titles, names like the Usos, The New Day, and DIY. But for as much as these teams have elevated the stock of the gold, none of them have been able to make us forget about the runs Shane McMahon and The Miz had with the gold back in early 2019. Why is this? Well, because their reign represented a low point for tag team wrestling, as all it turned out to be was a way to set up a feud between the pair for WrestleMania later that year, and not to make the belts themselves feel important. Which team lost so that this 21-day run could happen? Well, that would be The Bar, one of the great teams of the time in WWE. And this made it all the worse that The Miz and McMahon would have to hold the belts then, as it prematurely ended Sheamus and Cesaro's reign, a reign which could have been so much more. Even now, 6 years on, it still ranks at the bottom of the pile when we talk about the WWE Tag Team title runs. But what about the other set of tag team titles in WWE that we haven't talked about yet? The NXT Tag Team titles. Well, while they've also had some great reigns over the past decade or so, we're talking about teams like the Revival, DIY, and American Alpha here, there is a low end to that equation too, and that low end surprisingly comes from the New Day. Now, we all know the New Day are easily one of the most successful teams of their era, What with them having 11 reigns with the tag team titles across Raw and SmackDown over the course of their careers and all. But prior to 2022, one set of belts they'd never won in the company were the duos titles contested over down in NXT. So that's exactly why in December of that year they'd venture down to Florida to take these too. The only problem with this though was, once they won them, rather than elevate them with their star power, Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods did little with the developmental prizes. No, they seemed to just keep them warm for 56 days before dropping them to Gallus, with all this serving to leave the tag titles in the same spot they were in before. And it wasn't even as if the New Day's appearances on NXT throughout this 56-day period led to many great defenses in the meantime either. So for that reason, this run has to be considered a disappointment and the worst of any of the NXT tag team title runs to date. But at least the New Day aren't alone in having a bad title run, because as we've seen today, every belt in current day WWE has their fair share of these, and those who have had the worst of them all deserve to be recognized just as much as the best.